Welcome to the National World War II Museum virtually. My name is Jeremy Collins. I'm the Director of Conferences and Symposia here at the museum. And it's my pleasure to be hosting tonight's book conversation with David Davis, the author of Wheels of Courage. It's a great book, and we'll get to it in just a minute. As you all know, yesterday was Veterans Day here at the museum. We like to do Veterans Week. We actually say that every day is Veterans Day at the museum. But for our programming this year, which is done almost entirely virtually, I'd like to thank People's Health, the Department of Defense, AARP Louisiana, Navy Federal Credit Union, and Dow Chemical for providing funds and other resources to help us bring all of these programs to you. The stories of service and sacrifice often end when the battle ends. And this book, Wheels of Courage, tells the story of those who came home and how they had to deal with the physical scars of war in a country that wasn't necessarily built for that. Our guest tonight, David Davis, is the author or editor of 6 books, including Waterman, The Life and Times of Duke Kahana Moku, Showdown at Shepherd's Bush, the 1908 Olympic Marathon, and the 3 runners who launched a sporting craze, and Play-by-Play, Los Angeles sports photography from 1889 to 1989. He is from LA. He's in LA right now. David Davis began his career as a journalist with the LA Weekly newspaper. His works have appeared in Sports Illustrated, Smithsonian Magazine, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, SB Nation, and the original Deadspin, and Vice, among many others. You can check his website out after this conversation, of course, at ddavisla.com, which has a few of his articles that are available for reading. And I've just got to say, I think my favorite was the oral history of Gold's Gym. I didn't know there was a New Orleans connection to it.
Right.
Much like that coffee can over your right shoulder, the Cafe Du Monde coffee can. We love seeing that. David, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's an honor to be here virtually. I wish we could be together in person. Have family and a lot of friends in New Orleans, so just want to say hi to everybody as well. So thank you for having us.
Well, it's our pleasure to host you tonight, and we hope to have you when things are a little bit back to normal. What a great book. This is really a book that is new or not often seen enough on the library shelves of World War II. A quick personal note, my wife is an occupational therapist, so this hit home figuratively and literally, crossed our 2 professions, which I don't get to see too often. Can you tell our audience a little bit, before we start our conversation, a little bit about the book so that they can follow us better as we talk for the next 50 or 55 minutes?
Sure. Thank you. The book begins, I follow 3 veterans going into World War II and tell about how they were injured, how they were paralyzed, how they became paraplegics. And I know we'll go into that a little bit as we go on. So that's sort of, in a sense, the prologue of the book. But the main part of the book, I would say, the main part of the narrative is discussing how they recovered. Because before World War II, if you were paralyzed in battle, chances are you were not going to survive. By all statistics, that we could find, 80 or so % of wounded veterans from World War II who were paralyzed were dead within about 18 months. And that was because of disease, sepsis, bacteria, and the doctors didn't have the tools at that time to combat this. There was no such thing as penicillin. They didn't have the sulfa drugs, which they used on the battlefield in World War II, the medics, if they were able to get to the wounded men. And there were other components in terms of rehabilitation that had not been done before. The medical community called paraplegics dead enders and no hopers. And if you were lucky enough to survive, you were pretty much shunted away from society. You were put in institutions. You were maybe, or if your family could support you, you were in the family home. And one of the issues that was sort of interesting in terms of research and development, the wheelchairs back then, they were not designed for mobility at all. They were basically lazy boy chairs on wheels. And so there was no sort of chance of mobility. There was no chance of veterans who were paralyzed going to get a job, going to work, move around. And there was no such thing, finally, as sports, wheelchair sports. That had not been crossed anybody's mind because, as we said, the doctors assumed that you were basically going to die. So World War II is the game changer. You've got penicillin, the proliferation. You've got the sulfa drugs on the battlefield. You have surgical theaters right behind the front lines. And if there was any innovation from World War I, it was let's get help right away. That was the important thing that they realized. And also the evacuation. I think about World War I, you would have to get in an ocean liner just to get home. Well, by World War II, you've got airplanes, you've got air travel, so that you can get these men home and into the VA hospitals fairly quickly. And that was the game changer.
And I believe today they call it the golden hour. For somebody who's wounded on the battlefield, you have that 1 hour to get them, and their likelihood for living and recuperating is greatly increased. As you mentioned, you do focus on 3 individuals. Can you tell us a little bit about these 3, their pre-war lives, but also what action they saw and what ultimately led to their being wounded? Johnny, Stan, and Gene.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to share the screen here, so bear with me, please, audience. This would be the first gentleman on the right. That's Johnny Winterhaller, and his fiance at the time, Dessa Tippett. That's at University of Wyoming. Johnny Winterhaller was an amazing athlete before the war. Baseball, basketball, football. Perhaps could have had a professional career, frankly. He had went through school on an ROTC scholarship. And so, of course, after he graduated, he had some service time that he had to give back to the country. And I'm going to stop sharing that screen. What ended up happening, Johnny joined the Marines, and he was actually sent to the Philippines in 1941, which is, before Pearl Harbor. And he was in charge or talking about training the Philippine Army. So that's Johnny Winterhaller. Unfortunately for Johnny, he was captured on Corregidor in early 42. And he was placed in Japanese POW camps throughout the Philippines until the U.S. freed them in 1945. And that's how he was paralyzed. Lack of nutrition, lack of medical care in the POW camps. And so when he finally came back to the VA hospitals or the Naval Hospital here, he had lost the use of his legs. And so obviously a bit of a sad story. And obviously we'll talk a little bit about what happened afterwards, but his high school, college sweetheart, Dessa, stood by him, and they ended up marrying actually at the Naval Hospital. One of the other gentlemen that I write about in the book is, and this is Jerry Fessenmeier, an Iowa farm boy. He just was a helper on his family farm, did everything, plant the crops, deal with the hogs, run the tractor, that sort of thing. Pearl Harbor came along, and like a lot of young men, he instantly joined. He was underage, but he did join the Marines as a reserve, and then he told me that on the day of his high school graduation, he jumped off the stage, caught a bus, and was ready ready for battle as soon as he could. And I love this photo, of course, and he must be about 18 years old at this point. He told me, and just for the audience, he was alive when I first started researching and writing the book. So I was able to meet with him personally, and I dedicate the book to him. He told me he was being trained for the invasion of the home islands of Japan. If that was to come to happen, of course, President Truman decided to drop the atomic bomb. But he ended up fighting at the Battle of Okinawa. He was shot by a sniper holding a Nambu, and was evacuated to the beach, managed to survive, finally got home to California. He told me he weighed about 70 pounds at that time. And he told me that the men around him were placing bets as to whether he would survive the night or not. And sure enough, he did. And he passed away in 2018. So he lived a very, very long life. And I'll maybe go into what he did afterwards. I'm going to stop sharing. And then the last veteran that I concentrate on is a gentleman named Den Adele. He and his family were born in the Midwest, but ended up in California. He really wanted to join the forestry service. He maybe a park ranger or something like that. But he was drafted after Pearl Harbor. He was super smart with his tests. He was put into the what they called the ASTP, the Army Specialized Training Program, which was for very, very bright, intelligent people. They were trying to train. This was a short-lived program. Henry Kissinger was in this program, Mel Brooks, some others, prominent people. Den Adele ended up fighting at Battle of the Bulge, and that he was shot in the back in the waning days of the war. And he was then evacuated and brought back to California, and ended up again having a very, very long life, and was involved in the invention of wheelchair basketball at the Birmingham VA hospital in Van Nuys, California. So those are the three veterans that I wrote about, and I apologize for rambling on, but their stories are so compelling, so I apologize.
And this is why our audience is here, is to hear those individual stories and to remember that behind every text we read, there is a young boy wearing a Marine Corps cap. And by the way, happy birthday to all our Marines out there on November 10th, a couple days late. You had mentioned in your opening that these individuals historically had been seen as dead enders or no-hopers. Tell us how the doctors of the time, of the 30s and 40s, dealt with paraplegia, and then also introduce us to some of the key medical players, Dr. Monroe, Dr. Boars, Dr. Rusk as well.
Right. As we mentioned before, before the 30s, there was no care for paraplegia. The first gentleman to really successfully deal with paralyzed veterans, but he actually did it a little bit before the war, was Dr. Monroe in the Boston area. He had a very, very small clinic. I'll share a screen here with you on this just so you can see him. He's the second gentleman on the left. This is an older photo from the Boston area. He basically invented the care of paraplegia, which is to say holistic care, 24-hour care. The nurses, everybody would be involved. He would gather all of the experts with each patient, because paraplegia it's a very complex injury. Somebody who might show different symptoms. So each one had to be treated individually. Bed sores, for instance, were a huge concern. So he would devise that they would turn the patient over every 2 hours. And so, I mean, this is a 24-hour care. He also realized that people who have suddenly lost the use of their legs, it's as much a psychological trauma as it is a physical one. And so you really need to work on the spirit, so to speak, of the individual to say, you know what, there is a chance, an opportunity for a long life and a really good life, a good quality of life. The patient has to do some exercises and get ready. And you can see on that bed that the patient is like those bars over each of his shoulders. That's so he can lift himself up. And also at the same time, it sort of strengthens the upper body and helps, which is so important for people who've lost the use of their legs. They need their upper body to use the wheelchairs or get around. And I'll stop sharing that photo. So that was Dr. Monroe's contribution. In other words, he was the first to say, you know what, with quality care, 24 hours, these men can improve. When World War II comes around, this is unprecedented what the VA does, which is they create 7 distinct spinal cord injury units within VA hospitals across the nation. And in each of those 7 spinal cord injury units, there was one person in charge of the care of the patients. We mentioned Den Adele, for instance. Excuse me. So here is the doctor who is in charge there, which was Birmingham Hospital in Van Nuys, California, which is San Fernando Valley. This is Ernest Boars, who was born in Europe. He was a Jewish neurosurgeon. He fled the Nazis and ended up in California and working with the VA. And Boars took the precepts of Monroe and brought it to the men. He also was super smart in the sense of when the men started to, wheel around in their wheelchairs and start getting a spirit of, okay, we can move on, we can live and we can move on. He encouraged them to organize and form their own group, like almost a support group that we would call today. And that was the beginnings of the Paralyzed Veterans of America, which an organization that still exists today. And through that, the veterans were able to empower themselves and, as we'll talk about maybe a little later, lobby for disability rights and so forth. And I'll stop sharing that screen of Dr. Boars. Meanwhile, there were other doctors across the nation. The other doctor that we like to mention is Dr. Howard Rusk, who was in New York. He worked with veterans, but also with civilians. And he was very influential because he had a column in the New York Times that he wrote. And he was one of the first to write about extensively in popular. I mean, he would write in the medical journals, but also in places like the New York Times that was syndicated and picked up around the nation about the fact that men with paraplegia, these paralyzed veterans, were going to live and have a long life. And they just needed some basic help, whether it was vocational training or rehabilitation that ended up being recreation.
And it's a great segue holistically to take care of the whole person and psychologically as well. And now we enter Bob Reneerson. And he was a sporto. He was I guess that's a nicer way of saying jock. He was a coach's son, which I found interesting because I've never was a coach's son, but a lot of my best buddies were, and they were a different breed. He played an integral role in the veterans' stories, in your story and in the development of this sport. Can you tell us about how he got it off the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. And just I want to just backtrack 1 second on disability, and just to point out, and I won't show any photos because there were none, but just to consider that the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we know he had polio when he was a young man. He got around in a wheelchair. He never let himself be photographed in a wheelchair. He felt that was a stigma, because there was a stigma about disability. He didn't want to show a weakness, as President of the United States. So that's what the men, as they came back from war, that's what they were facing. There were no kneeling buses. There were no handicapped parking spaces. There were no ramps, no nothing. So interestingly, while the VA is encouraging these men and helping these men vocationally and recreation, yes, Bob Ranierson, and I'll show a photo of him and then what he moved on from. Bob Ranierson was a coach's son in Van Nuys. He had a job as a physical education therapist at the hospital, and he was supposed to take care of both, wounded men, but also the paralyzed veterans. And he set up some sports programs. What he noticed was at the gym at the hospital, after practice, the men in the wheelchairs would roll onto the court and start tossing the ball around. And it sort of occurred to him that, hey, maybe this would be something that would interest the men. And it was sort of counterintuitive, because when we think about basketball, whether it's Anthony Davis with the New Orleans Pelicans / LA Lakers, you think about height, you think about, of course, athleticism, running up and down the court, jumping for rebounds, jump shots, that sort of thing. And yet a basketball court being flat, being smooth, and being big enough to encompass 10 men in wheelchairs actually was a pretty a good fit versus, wheeling a wheelchair on turf, to play football or something. Because they were trying to find a sport, a team sport that the men could embrace. And again, talking about the sort of the psychological element that would be part of this sort of new normal for the men. And I'm going to bring another photo in, and we'll see. And here is Bob Ranierson. He's the referee in this photo, and this is the Birmingham gym. And this is probably 1946, 47, one of the first instances of wheelchair basketball, wheelchair sports in general. And a couple of the key decisions that they had to make at that time was what to do with the basket. Should they lower the basket for the men because they're sitting in these wheelchairs? And according to the historians I've spoken with for the book, the men said, no, we want the basket where it is, and where the foul line is, that sort of thing. So, but of course, Reneerson had some other adjustments that he would make with the rules as well. And I'll stop sharing the photo. Yeah.
David, I think in your book, you quote one of the veterans who said that they found it condescending to adjust the height and to change the layout of the court. We have the Naismith 13, the founding father of basketball. James Naismith created these 13 rules for basketball. What were the rules? Were there accommodations for those in wheelchair basketball?
Right, and that was Bob Reneerson was he codified the first set of rules. His instinct was to keep it as close to two-legged basketball as possible. So pretty much everything was the same, but for instance, with a wheelchair. He conceived of the wheelchair as part of the body. And so that would imply, if you ram your wheelchair into my wheelchair, well, that's a foul, right? So maybe seems obvious, but at the time, it was, in the beginning, people were just sort of rolling up and down the court and there were no rules. And it was fun to watch, but there was sort of no structure. One of the key rules that he did, and it ended up lasting to this day, is what they would call the 2-push rule. And so if you have the ball you're in your wheelchair, let's say you have possession of the ball and you're going towards the basket on offense, you, with one of your arms, you push once, you push twice. Okay, now you got to make a decision. You either dribble, you either pass, you shoot, you got to do something. Or if you dribble, then you can keep pushing. But that gave some structure to what the game was. And remember, the game at that time was very different than it is two-legged basketball. There was no 24-second clock, nothing like that. So there were certain rules he didn't have to worry about. I think the one other rule that was interesting was, we have the 10-second rule when you dribble across midcourt. For the wheelchairs, they made it 15 seconds. So little rules like that, but it became within the VAs, each team came up with different rules. And so it took a while for the basketball players to sort of figure out, okay, we need one set of rules for everybody.
You mentioned the team aspect of basketball, which these guys, most of whom had played sports in their youth, all of them were on a team of sorts while in the service. There were other physical activities. Can you share with that? And was this really was the team aspect, the team sport, what drew so many to this?
I missed that last part there, Jeremy. Sorry.
So there were individual sports that were offered. I think you mentioned archery and obviously swimming.
Yeah.
Was it the team aspect that drew so many of the wounded veterans towards wheelchair basketball? Or
yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I'll show you one team photo just to highlight what we have, and I can point out. I mentioned Johnny Winterhaller before. Here he is on the wheelchair basketball team, and he's sitting in the center holding the basketball. He's right in the center. And Jerry Gene Fessenmeier is the one on the far right, number 1, holding the basketball. And the team was called the Rolling Devils. They were at Naval Hospital Corona in Southern California, about 50 miles east of Los Angeles. And yeah, I mean, what you said is right. And Jerry Gene Fessenmeier, who, like I said, was still alive and I was able to interview, he just said this was fun. And when you talk about how do you get to a new normal for those who have been afflicted with paraplegia on the battlefield, these are 18, 25-year-old men in the prime of their life, all of a sudden understood that they can't use those legs for the rest of their lives. So basketball was a healing factor, it was a psychological factor, and it was something, as you would say, I mean, being on a team, what a great way to get through this harsh rehabilitation and this initial time. You're sharing it with all these men, sort of like, obviously being in the Army or being in the Marines, being in the Navy. This is a camaraderie aspect that I think was important in their healing. And Den Adele, who wrote about his time very eloquently. I mean, when people would have accidents in their wheelchair, when they'd fall out they would just trade insults, in a friendly way. And it normalized their condition, I think, to them, and was important in their healing. I'll stop sharing that.
Yeah, I think anyone who's playing basketball would feel a little awkward if they weren't being trash talked by their buddy on the other team.
Right. Exactly.
So, um, uh, the, the the games start to be played, exhibition games, but you had mentioned that different VA hospitals where this was picking up had different rules. Was there, how did they come to a codification of rules from California to New York, all over the country?
Yeah, the main uh, hospital that had different rules was actually in Massachusetts, and one of the ones in New York. They had just started doing things differently. Um, that really took a couple of years, and partly that was the PVA, Paralyzed Veterans of America, that I mentioned before. At some point during like 1948, 1949, the PVA teams, along with a gentleman, a veteran, but an able-bodied gentleman from the University of Illinois, Timothy Nugent, who sort of is the catalyst for taking the game out of the VA hospitals sort of into the mainstream. In other words, the men are have now rehabilitated. They leave the hospitals. They go back to their families or settle in hometowns, new hometowns near the hospital. So the teams from the VA hospital sort of get broken up. But the men themselves organize the teams outside the hospitals. And Dr. Nugent at University of Illinois, he's the one who says, hey, let's hold a basketball tournament. And he forms the National Wheelchair Basketball Association and holds tournaments. And by creating that, league, tournament, whatever you want to call it, they had to sit down and sort of hammer out the rules. And that's what they did. And Timothy Nugent was very smart. He was the commissioner, but he allowed the men, most of whom in those early days were veterans, to hold the key positions in leadership and in creating the rules and that sort of thing. And so it was sort of a successful melding of the veterans with civilians. And at that time, by the way, we're talking late 40s, early 50s, it was post-polio patients. They're the ones who first sort of joined the paralyzed veterans. So you have more of a cohort of players.
Now, you open your book in the prologue with the exhibition game, the March 10th, 1948 exhibition game. Tell us a little bit about that game, but more importantly, tell us about the crowd reaction.
Yeah. That was, to me, seeing that, or first of all, hearing about that game, then reading about it, and then seeing a little video about that was, to me, was revelatory in the sense of showing what those early games were like. And that was indeed an exhibition game between the VA hospital in Framingham, Massachusetts, Cushing VA, and Halloran VA Hospital on Staten Island in New York. And thanks to the urgings of Ed Sullivan, who, of course, becomes famous for his TV show, but at the time he was a nightlife columnist, and he encouraged Madison Square Garden to stage this exhibition, which they did in front of 15,500 people before a New York Knicks game. And in reading the accounts of that game, it was amazing because the crowd in the beginning were sort of holding their breath. Most people had never seen somebody in a wheelchair, much less playing a basketball game in a wheelchair. And to see these men sort of racing up and down the court, they were holding their breath. And meanwhile, everybody's smoking cigarettes because it's 1948 in New York City, and there's this cloud of smoke overhead. And the men are racing around, and they have collisions, and they fall to the court. And you know what? They get up and get into their chairs. They get helped. They know how to do it because they've worked out. They have exercise. They've strengthened their upper bodies. And they basically are showing to the audience and then the world, hey, we're okay. We're going to take a few bangs, but we're going to get up and we're going to keep going. And I'm going to share this one photo. And that game was covered quite extensively. It was in newsreels, and a little bit afterwards, here you have one of the star players, Jack Gerhardt, wounded at Normandy, actually, posing in his wheelchair, in his uniform. And again, when we think about President Roosevelt not letting himself be photographed, and here's a veteran saying, you know what, here I am, look at me. And by the way, we're pretty good at what we do, playing this basketball. And Jack Gerhardt he's in the Hall of Fame, the National Wheelchair Basketball Hall of Fame. So this was a big moment. And this is 1948. The next year, you have Hollywood producers getting interested in this story because everybody covered it, every magazine and newspaper in the country. And in 1950, you have a movie called The Men, starring Marlon Brando. And I don't have that clip lined up, but I know we'll have it for the audience to see later on. And that was Marlon Brando's first starring role. And it was shot at the Birmingham VA hospital in Van Nuys, and a lot of the veterans were extras.
And my colleague Tanya, who's running the behind-the-scenes technical aspects, should be posting a link. The National Archives has the whole film, The Men, streaming for free. So I enjoyed watching that. And as I told David before we started, though it's a good film, the book is better than the film. So, but it is I could see a lot of your book in the movie and vice versa.
Right.
One of the quotes that really caught me, and it took me back to your prologue. The audience, the crowd, was nervous and didn't know how to respond. And I don't use this word, but for the time, the audience felt almost like they were at a freak show, and they didn't know whether to laugh or cry or applaud or be silent. And that first fall, and then the player getting up and back in the chair, and the game is continuing. Everybody knows that they're watching a real game and that they can applaud, they can cheer on their team. Stan, one of your primary characters, was quoted. He said, "We got tired of having people stare at us just because we were sitting in these chairs. Now they watch us because we are doing something. The crowds loved it." And that really, just reading it now, it still hits me that, they're serving a purpose. They're serving multiple purposes, first and foremost for themselves. But also they're providing entertainment. This is a sport like any other.
Yeah. I'm going to share a photo. Here's a crowd photo from a different game. And this is the reaction. And we talked about the Madison Square Garden game. That was between two teams of veterans. Because certainly in the early days, there weren't that many wheelchair basketball teams. The teams would play locally. They would play exhibitions against semi-pro, professional college teams that would able-bodied athletes who would use wheelchairs for the occasion. In other words, they would hop into a wheelchair and play against the Paralyzed Veterans. And every time, the Paralyzed Veterans would win easily because they were so used to manipulating a wheelchair, which I tried it. It is, if you haven't done it, it is very, very difficult to control the wheelchair, go back and forth, shoot, pass, defend. And this crowd, you can see they're laughing and uproariously in this crowd photo. And that's because they're laughing at the other team. They're laughing at the able-bodied team because they can't keep up. And in a sense, that's maybe one of the first times in history that we see that, where it's the men who are handicapped showing off a skill that the able-bodied men can't keep up with. So it was an interesting, I've used this line before. In a sense, they were the Helen Kellers of paraplegia. They were out there in front of the public, and they didn't want any pity. They didn't want anybody's sympathy. They just wanted to be treated as anybody else would be, any other veteran.
You reference a sports writer in Boston, I think for the Celtics, who had previously to an exhibition game joked at how bad they were, that guys in wheelchairs could beat the Celtics. And sure enough, there was an exhibition game, but it sort of flipped it on its head because of what you just said. It's so hard to maneuver and to have those skills in addition to the basketball skills.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're not wrapping up yet, but I do see a lot of questions coming in. We don't want to lose sight of the three boys you started this with, Johnny, Stan, and Gene. Can you tell us about their discharge from the VA, what the rest of their lives were? You indicated one lived very long, to 2018. Another got married. How were their lives, albeit changed forever by World War II?
Yeah. The first thing that's sort of interesting is none of them ended up having a long wheelchair basketball career. In other words, like a lot of the veterans who were the pioneering athletes, they once they were out of the hospital and moving on, they moved on with their lives. And, they had very full lives. So Johnny Winterhaller, the great athlete from Wyoming, married his high school and college sweetheart, Dessa. He ended up training to be an accountant or training in accountancy. He ended up taking a job as the office manager for the doctor who basically saved his life at Naval Hospital Corona. That was Dr. Gerald Gray, who practiced in Oakland area in California. So Johnny and Dessa moved up to the Bay Area in California, and that's what he spent the rest of his life up there. They adopted 2 kids, a boy and a girl, and they were able, through the lobbying of the PVA and others, they were able to build an accessible home for Johnny. In other words, a home with ramps, with widened doorways. And that was one of the benefits that the PVA did. They lobbied, and I can show you a photo of that in a second. But just to finish, he also lived a very long life. When he quit smoking, he was a lot healthier. And he didn't talk a lot about, and I found this interesting, last thought on Johnny, he didn't talk a lot about his POW experience. And he was of that greatest generation, and as many of you know, oftentimes didn't like to open up about that sort of thing. Where I would find evidence, he had to testify after the war about the Japanese commandant of the POW camp. So that was where I was able to learn a lot of the details of his experience in the POW, not from his daughter and son, who he didn't share that much with. Jerry Gene Fessenmeier, the Iowa farm boy, he tried to move back, but he found that with a wheelchair in Iowa winters, and they lived on a farm with an outhouse, and trying to get to an outhouse in the middle of winter on a wheelchair, basically said forget about it, and moved back to California, where he had a better support and he was near his hospital. He was married a couple times. He was determined, I think because he was so close to death, he was determined to live out his life just living. And he lived in Hawaii for years. He lived in Southern California. He had a stint in Mexico that is generally considered X-rated as to what the men were doing down there. I'll just say a lot of expats ended up in Mexico because they could live very cheaply, and they took over Guadalajara and they called it Quadalajara. So that was Jerry, and he ended up in Texas, down close to the border, and lived until 90 something. and 2018 is when he passed. Den Adele, let me see if I can show this photo while we're talking. Den Adele, as I said, was part of the first team. This is a shot of the men from Birmingham Hospital as they're about to leave for their first road trip. And they were called the Flying Wheels. And Stan is in the wheelchair, third from the right. If you look over two more to the left, you'll see a nurse standing there. Stan and Peggy fell in love. When he came home, he asked her to marry him, and she did. And actually, quite a few of the men ended up marrying their nurses or physical therapists. And Stan was he had an amazing life. He ended up using the GI Bill to go back to college. He got his MBA from UCLA in like 1952. Did the same thing as Johnny, built an accessible home for he and his family. They adopted a daughter, and he ended up spending his entire career with Bank of America, ended up as a vice president, and always worked in disability rights and lobbying for people with disabilities in the community. So he lived a full life.
Well, David, I'm sure that this conversation whets the appetite of the audience. I can tell by the number of questions we have rolling in.
I'm sorry that I babbled on. I'm sorry.
No, this is great, and I think that you still left enough for them to buy the book and read and learn more about it. Bill Bunky says, "Hi, Dave." I don't know if you know
Hi, Bill. Good to see you.
We have a question from Andy Davis, and it's a very good one. The armed forces were segregated in the 1940s. Were the wheelchair teams also segregated?
Yes, it's a good question. Interestingly enough, as you know, Jeremy, the armed forces were segregated up until Truman's declaration in, 48. Because the hospitals for African-American men and women, but for servicemen, were not able to provide the services for paraplegia. The men, African-American men who were wounded, were allowed into the hospitals, like Birmingham VA and so forth. They even were in the Marines Hospital, the Naval Hospital Corona, which was Marines and Navy. They integrated because that was the only place they could get care. They were not on some of the initial teams, but we were able to find some African Americans early on in some of the early teams after they came out of the VA hospitals. The Bulliva Watchmakers team had a Maurice Brooks, who was in the Heinz VA, and some others. So yeah, it did come out.
We're going to get to Catherine Fuller's question because she is the one who is breaking curfew the most. She's in London watching.
Oh,
how did you get interested in this subject, and how did you meet the three men? Did you meet the three men you featured?
Right. Thank you. Thanks for staying up. We didn't even get to talk about Dr. Ludwig Gutmann and his work in London, but that'll be for another program. I honestly, I stumbled onto this story. I'm a journalist, and it was something, I stumbled onto the Naval Hospital in Corona and the Rolling Devils. And I was sort of fascinated. I love the name, the Rolling Devils. That's a team I would want to play for. But once I met, and you asked who did I meet? Unfortunately, I only met one, which was Jerry Gene Fessenmeier. Once I met him, once he started telling me stories about what they had to deal with paraplegia and the doctors and the care, that's when I knew it was a book. And I know, like I said, in London, they've written quite a bit about Ludwig Gutmann, as well they should. He's considered the godfather of the Paralympics. But nobody has really written about the paralyzed veterans here. And I think that contribution, their resilience, their courage, what they were able to bring to the rest of the world, I thought was worth spending 4 years researching and writing. So here we are.
Well, we're glad you did. Janice would like to, she says she's surprised to hear a few doctors had experience with paralysis given the number of polio patients around at the time. Any idea why this was?
Yeah, that's a great question. When at least when I was doing the research on the polio epidemic, I was looking at late 40s, early 50s. So I don't have experience as to what was happening before, but I do want to differentiate. Paraplegia is very different than what the polio patients were experiencing. I mean, paraplegia is very much so that, or at least as it is explained by the doctors, I mean, there is no sort of communication, right, between the brain and the body with a severed spinal cord, wherever that occurs. Polio is actually different in the sense of and it's all degrees, but polio, there might be some movement in the legs. And one of the earliest wheelchair basketball players with polio, he's still alive, Marv Lapicola. He ended up going to University of Illinois. He could actually, get on crutches and move around. Whereas most of the paralyzed veterans, maybe they could do that with heavy braces and crutches, but they would pretty much stick to the wheelchairs. So I hope that answers your question, but I would just say they're sort of apples and oranges. And I was really concentrating on the paraplegia aspect of it.
Eric asks, from your book, you speak of the advancement in the design of the chairs in terms of structure and materials. Were those improvements, specifically the materials, were they already available, or did the athletes see the advances and incorporate them into their lives and sport?
Wow, that's a great question. I'm going to find a wheelchair that I can show you. Bear with me for a second. Yeah, okay. So here would be this is a shot actually of England. This is in England. So take a look at those chairs. You've got the front, the big wheel in the front. Those are, padded. Those are basically like lazy boy chairs on wheels. Very little mobility with those outside of hospital institutional settings. And I'll stop sharing that. The wheelchairs that you saw with the Bob Ranierson game, that's a totally new one. And I'll give you one aspect of it. Sorry, I'm clicking around here. I apologize. So take a look at this wheelchair. So this is a state-of-the-art wheelchair for 1948. It's called Everest and Jennings, E&J. The company still exists. And that's Jerry Gene Fessenmeier being wheeled down a ramp before a game that the Rolling Devils played. And I bring that up. You can see the big wheels are in the back. It's hard to tell from this, that wheelchair weighed about 45 pounds. The wheelchairs that you saw in England, they're over 100 pounds. This wheelchair of Jerry Gene, it folds. So basically what that introduction did was these men could wheel themselves out to a car, specially adapted that they could, with hand controls, they could hop into the front seat, fold up that wheelchair, put it in the back, close the door, boom. They can go. They can get a job. They have mobility. They are quote unquote normal, just like anybody else coming in that. So that was a huge step. They weren't designed for sports, as you can tell, but they became actually state of the art for years until finally the athletes started to take control of their fate, and they redesigned these wheelchairs. They used different materials, and Now, if you watch the Paralympics, oh my gosh, I mean, it's custom built for each person's body, and every sport has its own, specially designed wheelchair. And I'll stop sharing. Yeah.
David, I'm going to take a few of the questions and meld them into a broader question that may take us to the finish line here.
Okay.
And it starts with Julia wondering if wheelchair sports spurred advances in wheelchairs and opened other opportunities for paraplegics. But the other questions that sort of blend into this is, what is the legacy? What is the legacy, not just of having a game or building the health of one individual or a team of individuals, laws that were passed, individuals who may have lobbied, as you said, a disabled rights activist. Can you sort of sum up? I know that's a big question with all the reach that they had.
Yeah, no, it's to me, it's it's their legacy, as you ask. And I'll show a photo again just to give you an idea. Let's see. Okay, so this is the Capitol steps, of course, in DC. This is the team from that Van Nuys, the hospital in Van Nuys, Birmingham. When they started playing in 1948, because they were out here in California sort of by themselves, they decided, we're going to take a road trip. We're going to play the other VA hospitals across the nation. And sure enough, they did. And this became an annual event, okay? And actually, it was right before that game at Madison Square Garden in 1948. Whenever they would end up in DC area, because there was a VA hospital in Virginia, so they would stop in DC and they would lobby for disability rights. And it's hard to tell, but there's a woman standing behind the team, and they became known as the Flying Wheels, by the way. That's a congresswoman from Massachusetts. Edith North Rogers, who was very much an advocate for veterans' rights. And what were some of the things that they fought for? Well, those adaptive cars. They got these veterans, the paralyzed veterans, got an allowance so that they could buy these cars that would enable them to get jobs and move around. Those houses I mentioned before, those accessible houses. Again, they lobbied Congress for that, and they were given a stipend to design and build accessible houses with ramps, widened doorways, bathrooms that were wide enough that you could wheel your wheelchair in. I'm going to share another photo, if you don't mind, to underline that. Again, when they were in DC, of course, Eisenhower, being the general that he was during World War II, he welcomed this is the Flying Wheels from 1955. So the legacy is sort of multifolded as far as I'm concerned. There's the sports legacy. In other words, this is the start of wheelchair sports, and the ... of that, and I'll stop sharing this photo. The ... to that is the Paralympics as we know them today. Between what was happening here in the United States and Ludwig Guttmann in England. So on a sporting level, it opens the door to sports for people with disabilities. And that becomes beyond paraplegia. As I mentioned, the post-polio, amputees, and then later on, women, youth, and of course, those with intellectual disabilities. So all that sort of starts with the World War II veterans, as far as we can trace. And then beyond that, I think with their organization, with the Paralyzed Veterans of America, with their lobbying efforts, and with these exhibitions, by the way, oftentimes the ticket prices would be donated to the PVA for research into paraplegia. So it was an awareness of disability that just because you have this type of disability doesn't mean you are a dead ender and a no-hoper. Absolutely not. What they showed is we have resilience. Yes, we've sacrificed our legs in the prime of our lives for our country. But we have this resiliency and a spirit, courageousness, however you want to call it, to keep going. And we're going to live, and I think just on a note, they had seen the horrors of war. Jerry Jean Fessenmeier on Okinawa, that's one of the ugliest battles of all time. He knew, in a sense, that he was lucky to be alive because he had seen what the other side was. And I think a lot of these men, once they were able to adjust to the new normal, sort of had it in them to go, you know what, I'm going to live life as best I can. And this handicap is just that, a handicap, not a big deal.
David, the military wars often create advancements. Those are often seen as technological advancements. Something's created for a war or for a reason. This story made me think that there were spiritual advancements, that there were emotional advancements, that these veterans who were dealing with their new burden, their new normal, they were able to lay the groundwork for the civilian population who was also dealing with that from birth or civilian accidents. And it's a great story. It's really you meld sports, war, and medicine all together, which you don't see too often. And it's Wheels of Courage: How Paralyzed Veterans from World War II Invented Wheelchair Sports, Fought for Disability Rights, and Inspired a Nation, by David Davis, who's been our wonderful guest tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the sponsors for the Veterans Day week programming. And most importantly, thank you to David Davis. We sure hope to get you down here as soon as we can, and you can get another can of Cafe Du Monde coffee. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate that. And thanks for the audience and the time. And yeah, I'd love to see you down there, and I'll bring the beignets myself, no problem.
Great. And thank you all for watching. Tune in to our website for our upcoming programs, and we look to have you there. Have a great evening.